Hi, my name is Michael Rand. I'm from Baruch College Business School. And thank you for being here. And I was glad to hear that GE is investing in environmental technology, which I've known about in the past. And I hope you do more of it. And my question is, though, are you, as a leader of GE, and do you think we in America are also willing to make the hard choices that have to be made? I mean, for example, you talked about doing environmental research and investment, but then you also talk about nuclear power. And as far as I know, with nuclear power, they still haven't solved the waste issue in the sense that it's sitting in reactor pools around the country because Nevada's not willing to accept it, and the issue is safely moving it, and it's extremely poisonous, et cetera, et cetera. So I think at some point, while it's nice to do everything, hard choices are going to have to be made, and I'm wondering if you are willing to say, you know, at GE, if it's not nuclear power, it's something else. You know, in the past we did it, we were involved.
Okay. No, I think part of my answer to your question is yes, and part of it's no. You know, in other words, I think what we believe in is that to have a real clean energy future, a diversity of fuels is really going to be important. And I would say I believe in kind of three things. I believe in technology is the answer. I believe that we need to have a real focus on reducing greenhouse gases, either cap and trade or some system that really addresses that. I totally believe in that. And I believe that in order to get to where we need to get to, you're going to need to have some form of a clean energy policy in the country that helps encourage that kind of activity as time goes on. We're in the nuclear power business. 20% of the world's installed base of nuclear power is GE technology. We're in the business. If you study it over long periods of time, MIT did a study in 2004 on nuclear power. You know, it's got a track record that is pretty difficult to refute in terms of being clean, being safe, and being productive. And you know what? If there's a future in nuclear power, I'm great with that. We're going to keep selling it. If there isn't, if you're right, I'm also great with that. You know, in other words, we do wind, we do gas, we do solar, we do a bunch of different things. And so I personally, as the company and both myself personally, I'm not going to advocate for or against nuclear power or other things, but I'm also working equally hard on solar, wind, and other technologies that can be effective in the future. And I don't know, how many people in this room support nuclear power? I'd say it's maybe a third, right? You know, fundamentally, there's nothing going on in the U.S. in nuclear power right now. I mean, it's talked about, it's discussed, but there's nothing really happening. So, like I'd say if we did everything well in the United States in the next decade, if we did everything well, we might be able to build 5 or 10 plants, 5 or 10, almost nothing. So, in other words, I'd say for all the lip service that's happened, there's just not much fundamentally going on. Yeah.
I agree with what you said about globalization, but how would you propose leveling the playing field? So how does New Balance, who makes their shoes in the United States, compete with Nike that makes them in Vietnam? And what do you do about situations like, you know, with China and the melamine? I mean, if you put melamine in the milk or the pet food here in the United States, you'd be crucified. And, you know, you do it in China and it gets swept under the rug.
You know, I'd give you a couple thoughts on globalization. You know, one is I think everybody that's in a factory or builds a factory in any place in the world, China, Mexico, any place else, ought to have the same standards that we use in the United States. So we ought to have the same quality standards, the same environmental standards. I don't think there should be any degradation at all on standards when you build factories any place in the world. I think that's the way most companies run their operation. The thing to be thinking about, right, in terms of globalization isn't tennis shoes, isn't Nike. Fundamentally, you know, whether or not we make tennis shoes here or Thailand, I would contend just isn't that important. It's how many engineers they're graduating every year in these countries. You know, look, it's not whether or not they can make tennis shoes. It's whether or not they're making MR scanners or jet engines or things like that. And so, I come back to, and I'm a complete globalist, so I know we've got a lot of people from outside the United States here today, but I would say for any country in the world, if you don't have a productive engineering base, ultimately you can't create enough wealth, I think, over time. And so this notion that we can be a service economy and magically everybody's going to pay our bills and we can run $1 trillion trade deficit and stuff like that, I'd use this crisis to say, you know what, maybe that's just not true. Maybe we ought to think of a different theory for what the economic foundation can be. And so that's how I think about globalization. The last thing I'd say is 3 businesses I give you. Our locomotive business, our jet engine business, and our turbine business. 80% of what we make in the U.S. gets exported. It goes to China, it goes to Saudi Arabia, it goes to Japan, it goes to places like that. So if we want to have high-paying manufacturing jobs in a country like the U.S. or Japan or other places, you have to have access to these countries in order to sell the high-value products that we make. And that's the other way I would think about globalization. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name's Sproul Love. I'm a second-year student at Columbia Business School. We hear a lot about the coming infrastructure crisis in the U.S., and I wonder if you could make some predictions about how either presidential candidate could affect government spending on infrastructure and what impact that would have on GE.
Again, I think there's different ways that you can approach it. One way is to say, as part of a national, and this gets commented on a little bit, job creation program, maybe we go out and build roads or power plants or, things like that. That's one way to approach it, is purely go back to what happened in the past and treat it that way. Another way to approach it is to say, you know what, it's really important for us to test whether or not nuclear power is going to be important. So we're going to do a $100 billion backstop for nuclear power, and we want to see 6 plants built, and that's the way to approach it. Another way is just to set higher standards. In other words, if you said, okay, here's a price for carbon, if you said, here's every bridge has to have XYZ standard, every piece of the infrastructure has to be that. That's another way to drive infrastructure investment inside the United States. I personally think it may take time for the U.S. to address its infrastructure needs. In the meantime, China, India, Eastern Europe, lots of other places are kind of going away with it. I was in China for the Olympics, and I visited the earthquake outside Chengdu. So basically you go to what's called a Tier 2 city in China, Chengdu, only 15, 20 million people, something like that. It's a Tier 2 city. And then it's an hour and a half out of Chengdu. And right until the moment you got to the earthquake, it was a 6-lane highway. 6-lane highway. It's better than the best road in Connecticut. It's a hell of a lot better than the Merritt or something like that, I would say, And that's who our competitors, in theory, are doing. Now, I sit here today and say, let's say there's a second stimulus package in the United States, which there almost certainly is going to be one, and it's hard because it's got to be fast, but the money also has to be spent. And some people say, do we give a tax rebate to people, or do we do a big infrastructure program? The problem with the big infrastructure program is just too slow. But I think the problem with giving consumers right now is they're so afraid they're not going to spend the money. I think if you think about what's happened with the banks so far, the banks have gotten lots of activity so far, but they haven't reinvested it back into lending again. And if you do the same thing with consumers, give them rebate checks of some kind, and they don't go out and buy a TV or a car, you're still sitting here without solving it. And so the notion behind creating some kind of infrastructure program is that it creates jobs and projects. The problem is it's too slow. So where that goes or anything. But I still believe that infrastructure is what information technology was in the 80s for 20 years. This is still the next thing. And I still believe in that completely.